Imagine being born a secret, a living curse on America's founding father. In the sweltering shadows of 1814 Kentucky, a boy opens his eyes to a world that wants him silenced forever. His blood? Tied to Thomas Jefferson himself. His fate? Divine judgment on a nation's hypocrisy. But what if this story could shatter the lies we still tell today? In the dim, oppressive haze of a Kentucky dawn in 1814, where the air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming tobacco leaves, a child drew his first breath not as a free soul, but as a whispered abomination in the eyes of a fractured empire. This was no ordinary birth, it was a rift in the veil of American sanctity, a moment where the sins of the fathers bled into the innocent. William Wells Brown entered the world on Dr. John Young's plantation, just outside Lexington, a city that masqueraded as the enlightened Athens of the West, with its grand columns and scholarly halls, yet throbbed with the rhythmic chains of human bondage. The sun rose that spring morning, painting the rolling fields in golden hues that mocked the darkness below, where enslaved hands toiled under the whip's shadow, their sweat mingling with the soil like offerings to a merciless god. William's mother, Elizabeth, cradled him in arms calloused from years of scrubbing floors and tending hearths in the main house. Her eyes, deep pools of quiet defiance, held the weight of generations stolen from African shores. She was no mere servant, she was a vessel of untold resilience, her spirit forged in the fires of loss and survival. Elizabeth had been born into chains, her own mother ripped away in a market auction's cruel bid. Now, as she nursed her son under the thatched roof of their cramped quarter, a space reeking of mildew and despair, she whispered prayers not just for his life, but for his soul. For William was marked by a paternal shadow that loomed like a biblical curse. His father was white, a relative of Dr. Young himself, though the name was never uttered aloud. This unholy union echoed the ancient tales of forbidden fruit, where power corrupted the pure, and the innocent paid the eternal price. In the scriptures, we read of sins visited upon the children, of bloodlines tainted by the hubris of kings. William's very existence was such a testament, a living embodiment of hypocrisy, or the Declaration of Independence's author, Thomas Jefferson, had fathered children in shadows similar to these. Whispers in the quarters spoke of Jefferson's own enslaved offspring, hidden away like guilty secrets, their lighter skin a badge of shame and privilege intertwined. William's features mirrored this torment, his skin glowed with a tawny hue, softer than the deep ebony of his mother's kin, his nose refined, his eyes piercing with an intelligence that unnerved the overseers. He was a ghost in the machine of slavery, a reminder that the lines between master and slave blurred in the dead of night, under covers of sin and silence. Lexington pulsed with this duality, its streets alive with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the murmur of intellectual debates in smoke-filled parlors. Transylvania University stood as a temple to knowledge, its halls echoing with lectures on liberty and human rights, drawn from Enlightenment thinkers who decried tyranny. Yet, mere blocks away, auction blocks groaned under the weight of human cargo, men, women, children inspected like cattle, their cries drowned by the haggling of merchants. The air carried the metallic tang of fear, mixed with the sweet rot of hemp fields that funded this facade. Dr. Young, a physician whose hands healed the affluent while exploiting the bound, embodied this moral rot. His home, with its whitewashed facade and manicured gardens, hid quarters where souls withered. William, from his earliest toddling steps, navigated this labyrinth of light and shadow, his small feet padding across dirt floors that felt like the earth's judgment beneath him. Elizabeth taught him survival as one teaches scripture, verse by verse, in hushed tones after the lanterns dimmed. "Watch the eyes, child," she'd murmur, her voice a soothing balm against the night's chill. "They reveal the storm before it breaks." She showed him how to bow without breaking, to fetch water from the well with a grace that disarmed suspicion. But beneath these lessons lay a deeper gospel, the righteousness of resistance, the divine injustice of chains forged by mortal greed. In the Bible's pages, smuggled and read in secret, she found parables of Exodus, of Pharaoh's fall, and she instilled in William a belief that slavery was not God's will, but man's perversion. "The Lord sees all," she'd say, her fingers tracing invisible crosses on his forehead. "And he will judge." This spiritual fire kindled in William's chest, a quiet ember that promised retribution, even as the world around him preached submission. As seasons turned, like pages in a forbidden book, William's world expanded in fragments of toil and observation. At 5, he carried pails heavy with river water, his arms aching under the burden, the sun blistering his skin until it peeled like old parchment. He served at Dr. Young's table during gatherings of the elite, lawyers in starched collars, merchants with gold watches, where talk of revolution and rights flowed like fine bourbon. The irony seared him. These men, quoting Jefferson's words on equality, dined on meals prepared by hands they deemed subhuman. William listened, his young mind absorbing the cadence of their speech, the hypocrisy of their laughter. One evening, as candlelight danced across silverware, he overheard a guest praise the natural order of things, while outside, the whip cracked like thunder, punishing a field hand for a moment's rest. The sound echoed in William's soul, a divine thunderclap warning of judgment to come. Dr. Young was no monster in the mold of folklore villains, his cruelty was subtler, a calculated dominion wrapped in paternalism. He fed his slaves cornmeal and pork scraps, sheltered them in leaky cabins that howled with winter winds, but his gaze held the cold detachment of ownership. William saw the lash fall, not often, but enough to scar the spirit. A woman named Sarah, caught stealing bread for her starving child, was stripped and flogged until her back ran red, her screams piercing the air like a siren's wail. Families shattered at his whim, a father sold south to settle a gambling debt, his wife's wails haunting the night like ghosts seeking vengeance. These acts weren't mere transactions, they were spiritual desecrations, rending the sacred bonds of kinship that God intended unbroken. In 1816, upheaval struck like a biblical plague. Dr. Young, lured by the promise of virgin lands in Missouri, uprooted his household. The journey was an exodus in reverse, a forced march into deeper wilderness, away from kin and toward uncertainty. William, barely 2, clung to Elizabeth's skirts as wagons creaked over rutted trails, flatboats bobbed on treacherous rivers. The Mississippi's waters swirled dark and foreboding, mirroring the dread in enslaved hearts. Whispers among the bound spoke of Missouri as a land of no return, where forests swallowed escapees and patrols hunted with hounds trained on human scent. Elizabeth held William close during starless nights, singing spirituals that masked coded messages of hope. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. These hymns weren't just melody, they were prayers for deliverance, invocations against the sin of captivity. Arriving in St. Charles County, the landscape assaulted the senses, dense woods alive with the rustle of unseen creatures, soil stubborn under the plow. Establishing the new plantation demanded blood and sweat, axes felled ancient oaks with resounding crashes, fields were carved from wilderness, buildings rose like reluctant monuments to ambition. William, now a child laborer, learned the grind of existence, hands blistered from hauling logs, back bent under loads that tested his frame. The air hummed with insects, the ground muddied with rain that turned paths to quagmires. Yet amid this toil, spiritual undercurrents stirred. In the quarters, after exhausting days, elders gathered under moonlight, sharing tales of African ancestors whose spirits watched over them. William absorbed these like sacred texts, feeling the weight of legacy, a chain not of iron, but of unbreakable heritage. By 7, William's duties evolved into a harsher rhythm. Fields during harvest swallowed him whole, the sun a relentless judge beating down as he picked tobacco leaves that stained his fingers green. In quieter seasons, he returned to the house, polishing boots and pouring drinks with a precision born of fear. Dr. Young began hiring him out, a profitable extension of ownership, sending him to neighbors' farms where labor was ceaseless. Here, William witnessed slavery's full spectrum, the broken, whose eyes dulled like tarnished silver, shuffling through days in numb resignation, the defiant, who sabotaged tools with sly precision or sang work songs laced with rebellion. Punishment for the bold was swift and biblical, lashes that evoked Christ's scourging, stocks that mimicked crucifixion, or the dreaded sail-down river, a descent into hellish cotton kingdoms where souls perished under endless toil. Elizabeth remained his spiritual compass, her presence a beacon in the storm. She recounted her own separations, siblings auctioned like heirlooms, infusing William with a moral clarity. Slavery was the devil's work, a perversion of divine order where masters played God. Hold your head high in secret, she'd advise, her voice trembling with restrained fury. The Almighty don't forget his children. This theology of justice fueled William's inner fire, a promise of redemption amid despair. He began to question the sermons preached from plantation pulpits, twisted scriptures justifying bondage, sensing the hypocrisy as a spiritual wound festering in the nation's heart. As adolescence dawned, William towered over peers, his frame honed by labor, his mind sharpened by clandestine learning. He taught himself letters from discarded newspapers, risking the lash for literacy's forbidden fruit. In Missouri, reading was a Crime against the enslaved, a spark that could ignite revolution. Yet William persisted, decoding words by firelight, his heart pounding with the thrill of stolen knowledge. This act was rebellion incarnate, a step toward claiming his soul from the abyss. In 1827, fate twisted again like a serpent in Eden. Dr. Young sold William to Samuel Willie, a St. Louis merchant, without farewell or mercy. The transaction was cold commerce. William, valued like livestock, was marched away from Elizabeth's embrace. The pain cleaved him, her face, etched with sorrow, haunted his dreams like a spectral visitation. This severance echoed the biblical rending of families, a sin crying out for heavenly vengeance. St. Louis assaulted his senses, the Mississippi's roar, steamboats belching smoke like infernal beasts, docks teeming with cargo and chaos. The city was a crossroads of worlds, French traders in fur caps, immigrants with hopeful eyes, free blacks navigating precarious liberty. For the first time, William beheld freedom's fragile form, black men owning barbershops, women laundering with independent grace. Their existence whispered possibilities, a divine hint that chains could shatter. Yet danger lurked, kidnappers prowled, ready to drag the free back into bondage's maw. Samuel Willie, William's new master, was a tempest of a man, whiskey-soaked, fist-ready, his tavern a den of rough souls near the waterfront. William served amid the din, clinking glasses, raucous laughter, the acrid stench of spilled ale. Willie's temper flared like lightning, bruises blooming on William's skin as reminders of subjugation. But the tavern was also a wellspring of revelation. Riverboat tales spun of northern free states, of the Underground Railroad, a clandestine path to salvation, guided by abolitionist angels. Whispers of escapes fueled William's spirit, planting seeds of defiance. In this cacophony, he pondered his bloodline's curse, ties to Jefferson, whose ideals clashed with his actions. A national sin begging for exposure. William's story, still unfolding, carried the weight of divine retribution, a narrative that would one day unmask the hypocrisy, demanding justice for the silenced. As nights lengthened in St. Louis, William's resolve hardened. The river's endless flow mirrored time's inexorable march toward reckoning. He felt the stirrings of a greater purpose, a calling to bear witness against the darkness. In the quiet hours, alone with his thoughts, he envisioned a world redeemed, where the guilty faced their maker, and the oppressed rose like Lazarus from the tomb. This was no mere survival, it was a spiritual odyssey, fraught with peril and promise, where one man's truth could topple empires of lies. The secrets William carried about blood, about power, about the soul's unquenchable thirst for freedom, simmered like a storm on the horizon. They linked him to Jefferson's hidden legacy, a thread of sin woven through America's fabric. In exposing them, William would invite wrath, but also invite grace. For in the end, divine justice demands the light, no matter the cost. And William Wells Brown, born in shadows, was destined to become that unrelenting flame. In the shadowed underbelly of St. Louis, where the Mississippi's waters lapped greedily at the docks like a serpent tasting its prey, William Wells Brown teetered on the edge of a moral abyss. The year was 1829, and the air hung heavy with the acrid smoke of steamboats and the muffled sobs of the bound. William, now a young man of 15, his frame hardened by years of unrelenting toil, found himself ensnared in a web of whispers and forbidden dreams. The tavern's clamor, clinking glasses, slurred tales of distant lands had planted seeds of rebellion in his soul. He overheard grizzled river men speak of northern lights, not celestial, but beacons of liberty, abolitionists in Ohio and Illinois, fiery preachers decrying the sin of human bondage as an affront to the Almighty. These stories stirred something primal within him, a spiritual awakening akin to Moses gazing upon the burning bush, realizing the chains around his wrists were not just iron, but the devil's own forgery against God's creation. Yet, escape loomed as a terrifying sacrament, a leap into the void where failure meant not just earthly torment, but perhaps divine condemnation for defying the order imposed by wicked men. The penalties were etched into the collective memory of the enslaved like verses from a grim scripture, whipping that flayed the flesh like Christ's scourging, branding with hot irons that seared the skin as a mark of Cain, or the ultimate exile sailed down the river to the cotton hells of the deep south, where souls withered under the sun's unyielding judgment. Slave catchers, those Judas figures prowling the roads with bloodhounds snarling like demons, were rewarded handsomely for every soul they dragged back to perdition. The path north wound through hostile lands, where a black man alone was a suspect, a walking provocation to the white gaze. And even in the promised lands of free states, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 hung like a Damocles sword, empowering kidnappers to reclaim property under the guise of law, a perversion of justice that mocked the biblical call for mercy. William wrestled with this in the quiet hours, his mind a battlefield of fear and faith. To remain enslaved was to surrender his spirit to eternal bondage, a living death where his destiny was scripted by another's whim, denying the divine spark God had placed in every soul. For what shall it profit a man, if he shall gain the whole world, and lose his own soul, he pondered, echoing the gospels he'd pieced together from overheard sermons. No, the alternative was unbearable, a slow crucifixion of the spirit. So, in secrecy, he began his preparations, methodical as a pilgrim charting a holy quest. He hoarded crusts of bread and scraps of dried meat, hidden in the folds of his ragged shirt. When errands took him near merchants' stalls, he stole glances at maps, memorizing the serpentine curves of rivers and the straight arrows of roads leading to Illinois and Ohio. Conversations became scripture, a boatman's casual mention of a shallow ford, a traveler's gripe about a patrolled bridge, all woven into his plan like threads in a tapestry of redemption. But fate, that capricious angel, intervened with a darker trial. Samuel Willie, plagued by debts that gnawed at his whiskey-soaked fortunes, hired William out to James Walker, a name whispered in the quarters like a curse from the book of Revelation. Walker was a slave trader, a scavenger of souls in a society that already feasted on human misery. Even among slaveholders, he was reviled as a vulture, profiting from the wreckage of lives while others cloaked their sins in paternalism. But Walker cared not for reputation, his god was gold, and his altar the auction block. His operation was a machine of brutality. Traversing Kentucky and Missouri, he bartered for the desperate, those owners shedding troublesome property or liquidating human assets to settle scores. Then, in coffles of despair, he marched them to steamboats. Bound for the deep South, Louisiana's swamps, Mississippi's endless fields, Alabama's cotton empires, where labor demands devoured lives like Moloch's fire. William's role in this infernal enterprise was a dagger to his conscience. He was to manage the cargo, a euphemism for enforcing the chains that bound others as they did him. It was a position of profound shame, forcing him into complicity with the very evil that had scarred his own life. Each dawn brought fresh horrors that haunted his dreams, visions that blurred the line between earthly suffering and spiritual damnation. Walker's expeditions began with the gathering. In dim barns or roadside pens, enslaved men, women, and children were herded like livestock, their eyes wide with terror under the lantern's flickering glow. The air reeked of sweat and fear, mingled with the metallic tang of fresh-forged shackles. Coffles formed long lines of humanity linked wrist to ankle, the clank of iron a rhythmic dirge echoing through the misty mornings. They marched miles over rutted paths, feet blistering on jagged stones, the weak prodded by whips that cracked like thunderbolts from an angry heaven. At the riverbanks, the steamboats awaited, massive beasts of wood and iron, their paddles churning the water into froth, smoke belching from stacks like the breath of Leviathan. William helped load them aboard, his hands trembling as he fastened chains to prevent the desperate from leaping into the river's embrace. The decks were a purgatory, crowded, fetid with the stench of unwashed bodies and sickness, exposed to the elements' wrath. By day, the sun scorched like the fires of Gehenna, blistering skin and parching throats. By night, chill winds howled through the cracks, carrying whispers of ghosts from drowned fugitives. Food was meager, stale cornbread and brackish water, doled out to preserve value, not life. Dysentery and fever ravaged the ranks, bodies convulsing in agony, their moans a chorus pleading for divine mercy. The dead were discarded without right, heaved overboard into the Mississippi's murky depths, where catfish feasted on the forsaken, a grim reminder that in this system, even death offered no sanctity. William's soul fractured under the weight of these atrocities. He witnessed mothers rent from infants, their wails piercing the air like the lamentations of Rachel weeping for her children. Husbands and wives, bound in love's fragile covenant, were sundered with cold indifference, their pleas falling on deaf ears. Young women, eyes haunted by foreknowledge of violation, faced futures of exploitation in plantation shadows. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, were demoted to field drudges, their talents crushed under the heel of profit. And in New Orleans markets, the climax of degradation unfolded, auction blocks under sweltering tents, where bodies were stripped, prodded, inspected like beasts at fair. Teeth pried open, muscles flexed on command, scars tallied as defects, the buyer's hands roaming with impunity, negotiating souls worth in dollars that belied their infinite value in God's eyes. One voyage in the spring of 1830 etched itself into William's spirit like a brand from hell. Among Walker's acquisitions was Eliza, a woman in her early 20s, her dark skin glowing under the sun's harsh scrutiny, her eyes pools of resilient wisdom. Purchased from a Virginia planter, she carried herself with a dignity that defied her chains, a quiet grace reminiscent of the biblical Esther facing her trials. William, drawn by an inexplicable kinship, risked Walker's wrath to converse with her during lulls in the journey. The steamboat's hum provided cover, its vibrations masking their hushed words. Eliza spoke of her past, a tobacco plantation where she served in the big house, befriended by the mistress's daughter who, in secret acts of rebellion, taught her letters from pilfered books. She saw me as human, Eliza whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. Risked the lash for both of us. There, amid the quarter's camaraderie, Eliza had found love with Samuel, dreaming of jumping the broom under starlit skies, a ritual marriage blessed by community if not by law. But death shattered this fragile Eden, the master perished, debts demanded payment, and Eliza was auctioned like chattel, torn from Samuel's arms without farewell. Sold to a Kentucky trader, then to Walker, she now hurtled toward New Orleans, each mile a nail in her coffin of hope. As she recounted her tale, tears brimmed but refused to spill, her composure a testament to inner fortitude forged in fire. William saw in her a mirror of his mother Elizabeth, strength unbowed, spirit unbroken. Yet, she was commodified, her humanity erased by ledgers and lashes. In New Orleans, under the auctioneer's gavel, Eliza was sold to a Mississippi planter, her final glance back at William a silent prayer for deliverance. He never learned her fate, but she became his emblem of systemic sin, a system that profaned God's image in man, shredding families like parchment, extinguishing love's light for greed's shadow. This encounter was William's Damascus Road, a spiritual epiphany where the scales fell from his eyes, revealing slavery as the ultimate blasphemy, a rebellion against the Creator's design for equality and compassion. He could no longer partake, complicity was soul suicide. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he murmured in prayer, drawing from Psalms, I will fear no evil. Resolve crystallized, he would flee, staking life on freedom's gamble, even if it meant forsaking chances to reunite with Elizabeth, whose whereabouts faded like morning mist. William's first bid for liberty came in the fall of 1833, after parting from Walker's horrors. Willie hired him to a steamboat captain bound up the Ohio River, a vessel of opulence, its decks gleaming with brass, chandeliers swaying in saloons where the wealthy dined oblivious to the engine. Room's inferno. William shoveled coal into furnaces, sweat streaming like baptismal waters, the heat a foretaste of hell's flames. The boat docked in Cincinnati, Ohio, a free soil sanctuary, buzzing with abolitionist fervor and free black communities thriving like oases in desert. Here, whispers of the Underground Railroad echoed, safe houses, coded signals, guides leading to Canaan. Seizing chaos amid unloading, William slipped away, heart pounding like a war drum. For fleeting hours, freedom enveloped him, a divine breath. He wandered streets alive with unchains, black barbers clipping hair with pride, families strolling without fear, churches ringing bells of hope. The air tasted sweeter, untainted by oppression's bile. But naivety betrayed him, penniless, friendless, his presence screamed fugitive. Slave catchers, mercenary wolves, pounced on a corner, iron grips silencing protests. Free blacks rallied, voices rising in righteous fury, but law favored the hunters. Jailed in a grim hold for runaways, William awaited reclamation, his spirit crying out like Job's lament. Willie arrived, rage boiling like brimstone. The return voyage was torment, taunts, threats, the river mocking his failed flight. Back in St. Louis, punishment awaited, a public whipping in the tavern yard, spectators forced to witness as deterrent. Stripped, bound to a post, William endured the lash's fury, each stroke ripping flesh, blood pooling like sacrificial offering. Pain surged, waves crashing against his resolve, but he stifled cries, clinging to dignity as Christ on the cross. The scars would knit, but the humiliation burned eternal, a brand on his soul, fueling rather than quenching his fire. Undeterred, William nursed wounds in body and spirit, biding time like a coiled serpent. He feigned submission, all while mapping escape, northern routes through woods, river crossings at low tide. Abolitionist havens in Illinois. Food hoarded, geography memorized, he pondered Elizabeth, her absence a thorn in his heart. Freedom first, he vowed, only then could he seek her, perhaps redeem her from chains. By late 1833, stars aligned. January 1, 1834 dawn frigid, frost glazing the earth like divine armor, winds howling off the Mississippi as harbingers of change. St. Louis slumbered post-revelry, streets ghostly quiet. Willie dispatched William on an errand, a message across town. Seizing Providence, he walked on, northbound toward Illinois, no provision save unyielding will. Cold nod, shoes hold letting in icy daggers, feet numbing as he veered from roads into forest's embrace. Each step a prayer, each breath a defiance against the abyss. The trek was a gauntlet of trials, hunger clawing his belly like famine's specter, thirst parched by frozen streams. He navigated by stars, those heavenly guides winking encouragement, evading patrols whose lanterns pierced the night like accusing eyes. Exhaustion tempted surrender, visions of warmth and bondage as false comfort, but spiritual conviction propelled him echoes of Exodus, the Israelites fleeing Pharaoh's yoke. Divine justice, he believed, demanded his liberty, to falter was to betray God's plan. After days of agony, William crossed into Illinois, collapsing in snowdrifts, soul alight with triumph. A Quaker family, embodiments of mercy, nursed him, Wells Brown and kin, whose name he adopted in gratitude, a rebirth symbolizing redemption. From fugitive to freeman, his journey transcended flesh, a spiritual resurrection, shattering chains that bound body and soul. Yet, scars lingered, memories of Mississippi's horrors, Eliza's dignity, the whip's bite. These fueled his future fire, transforming personal exodus into crusade against slavery's sin. William's escape wasn't mere flight, it was divine retribution's harbinger, a testament that even in darkness, light prevails. The Mississippi, once a river of tears, now whispered of hope, carrying tales of one man's unbreakable spirit toward a nation's reckoning. The wind screamed across the Illinois prairie like the wail of damned souls, whipping ice crystals into William Wells Brown's face until his cheeks burned raw. It was January 1834, and the world had turned to a merciless white void. Each step sank his threadbare shoes into snowdrifts that clawed at his legs like frozen talons. His toes had long since gone numb, then agonizing, then numb again, a cycle that whispered of frostbite, of amputation, of death in a ditch where no one would ever find him. Hunger gnawed deeper than the cold, a hollow beast in his gut that made his vision blur at the edges. For 3 days and nights he pressed north, a fugitive shadow fleeing the furrows of Missouri, his breath crystallizing in the air like fleeting prayers. He drank from streams only by smashing through their icy armor with bleeding fists, the water so cold it seared his throat like liquid fire. Food was whatever the barren winter grudgingly offered, frozen berries that tasted of earth and bitterness, roots pried from iron-hard soil with fingers that trembled uncontrollably. Shelter came in stolen moments, curling fetal and haylofts of abandoned barns, the sweet musty scent of dried grass a fleeting mercy against the night's killing frost. When no barn appeared, he burrowed into snowbanks or pressed against tree trunks, shivering violently through endless hours, wondering if dawn would find him stiff and lifeless, another unnamed casualty claimed by freedom's cruel toll. Every sound was Judgment Day arriving early. A branch cracking under snow's weight jolted him upright, heart thundering. The distant howl of wolves carried echoes of bloodhounds, those demonic beasts slave catchers loosed on runaways, trained to tear flesh from bone. William had heard the stories. Fugitives found half-eaten, their screams echoing through quarters as warnings. Better to freeze, he told himself, than feel those jaws close. Better to die pursuing the divine image God had placed in him than live as another's property. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he whispered into the wind, the psalm his mother's voice in his frozen mind, I will fear no evil. He would rather meet his Maker here, free, than return in chains to Samuel Willie's whip. On the third dawn, delirium painted the horizon with false promises. William staggered into Quincy, Illinois, a town whose very name meant sanctuary in a free state where slavery's legal chains supposedly ended. But he knew better. The fugitive slave law cast its shadow even here. Catchers prowled Illinois streets with the same impunity as Missouri's, laws bending to reward money over morality. One wrong glance, one suspicious white face, and iron manacles would snap shut again. He kept to alleys, hood pulled low, body shaking not just from cold but from the terror of recapture. Where could a stranger turn? Who dared help a black man whose very existence screamed fugitive? Then, like an answer to unspoken prayer, Providence appeared in human form. Wells Brown, a Quaker farmer with eyes like calm winter pools and a beard frosted white, spotted him from across Quincy's snowy street. Brown was in town for supplies, his wagon creaking under sacks of flour and feed. But his gaze locked on the gaunt young man shivering against a storefront, clothes ragged and iced, face hollowed by starvation, eyes wild with the hunted look Brown knew too well from years on the Underground Railroad. The Quakers believed fiercely in the inner light, that divine spark equal in every soul, black or white, enslaved or free. To them, aiding fugitives wasn't charity, it was obedience to God, a defiance of man's wicked laws that mocked the Creator's equality. Brown approached slowly, hands visible, voice soft as falling snow. "Friend, thee looks in need of warmth. Can I help thee?" William tensed, every instinct screaming trap. White kindness had always come with strings, often chains. But something in Brown's steady gaze, a compassion untainted by superiority, pierced his armor. Exhaustion and desperation won. "I'm running," William rasped, voice cracked from cold. "From Missouri." Brown nodded once, no judgment, no demand for proof. "Come with me." The farm lay miles outside Quincy, a modest house of weathered timber, smoke curling from its chimney like an invitation from heaven. Inside, the hearth roared with blessed heat, the scent of baking bread and simmering stew wrapping William like a mother's embrace. Mrs. Brown took one look at the half-frozen stranger and bustled into action, hot soup thick with potatoes and carrots, fresh cornbread slathered in butter, coffee strong enough to thaw bones. William ate slowly at first, fearing his shrunken stomach would rebel, then with the ravenous gratitude of a man tasting resurrection. Over the next days, hidden in the Browns' attic, a secret room with a concealed door, William recovered body and spirit. Wells Brown explained the peril. Quincy teemed with catchers, fugitives vanished regularly, dragged south despite Illinois law. True safety lay further north, Chicago, then Canada, where British soil meant irrevocable freedom. But first, rest. Heal. Prepare. In the evenings, by firelight that danced golden across rough-hewn walls, the two men talked. William poured out years of bottled anguish, words tumbling like floodwaters breaking a dam. He spoke of Elizabeth, his mother's quiet strength, her secret teachings of dignity and divine justice, the agony of their separation that still bled in his heart. He recounted the slave trader Walker's horrors, coffles clanking toward hellish steamboats, mothers' screams as children were torn away, bodies discarded into the Mississippi like refuse. He told of Eliza, her unbowed spirit sold south, and the countless others reduced to commodities. He described his failed Cincinnati escape, the public whipping that flayed his back and seared his soul. Wells Brown listened, face etched with sorrow and righteous fury. Abstract principles became flesh and blood. This was no distant evil, but a young man's crucified life. In return, Brown shared the Underground Railroad sacred workings, coded hymns, lantern signals and windows, conductors guiding souls station to station like modern Moseses. Risk was ever present, fines, imprisonment, mob violence. Yet Quakers and allies persisted, convinced that harboring fugitives fulfilled Christ's command to love neighbor as self. When strength returned, Brown equipped William for the road ahead, warm wool coat, sturdy boots, provisions wrapped in cloth, even coins, money William had never held as his own. Most precious was a letter of introduction to Northern abolitionists, a passport through the network. And words that rang like a benediction, "Thou art a free man now. Live as one." William pressed north through Illinois into Wisconsin, traveling nocturnal paths under starlit skies that now seemed conspirators rather than witnesses. Safe houses materialized, farmers' attics, church basements, each a miracle of human goodness defying systemic evil. Conductors appeared like guardian angels, guiding him past patrols. Weeks blurred into a tense pilgrimage until, at last, he boarded a ferry across Lake Erie. As Canadian soil crunched beneath his boots, a weight lifted, an almost physical sensation, chains dissolving into mist. Here, no American law could touch him. He was sovereign over his own flesh. But freedom revealed new trials. In St. Catharines, Ontario, a haven for fugitives, William joined a community rebuilding shattered lives. He labored on docks unloading ships, split wood until muscles screamed, any honest work that paid wages into his own pocket. The pay was meager, the toil brutal, yet infinitely sweeter. His sweat enriched himself, not a master. This was the first taste of true manhood. Yet survival wasn't enough. A deeper hunger gnawed, the thirst for knowledge stolen by slavery's prohibition on black literacy. William invested every spare coin in books, devouring them by flickering candlelight that cast long shadows across his tiny room. History unveiled empires risen and fallen on justice's scales. Philosophy probed the soul's nature. Literature, from Shakespeare to abolitionist tracts, ignited his imagination. He studied Garrison's thunderous editorials, Douglas's emerging voice, grammar texts that polished his raw intellect into a weapon. And he began to write. First came letters, then essays, vivid accounts of bondage's cruelties, infused with moral fire and unflinching truth. His prose carried slavery's stench, the auction block's degradation, the whip song, families rent like cloth. Words became his new rebellion, more dangerous than flight. In 1836, drawn by abolitionist fervor, William crossed back into New York cautiously, for danger lingered, and settled in Buffalo. The city's anti-slavery society buzzed with activists plotting slavery's demise through law, persuasion, and direct aid. Invited to speak, William stood before a white audience, heart-pounding, and unleashed his testimony. His voice, clear, passionate, honed by years of silent observation, painted slavery's horrors in strokes so vivid the room seemed to reek of blood and tears. When he finished, silence reigned, then thunderous applause. He had found his calling. Soon, William Wells Brown, adopting his benefactor's name in eternal gratitude, became the abolitionist circuit's rising star. He traversed New York, Pennsylvania, New England, churches packed to rafters, town halls echoing his words, outdoor gatherings swelling to thousands. He spoke not in dry statistics but living truth, Elizabeth's lessons in the quarters, Eliza's dignity in chains, the hypocrisy of a nation birthing all men are created equal while trafficking in human souls. Audiences wept, raged, pledged funds and action. But truth-telling invited retribution. Pro-slavery mobs disrupted lectures, hurling rotten eggs, shouting slurs, brandishing weapons. William endured beatings, emerging bloodied but unbroken, his scars badges of honor in freedom's war. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 escalated the peril, transforming free states into hunting grounds, mandating citizens aid catchers under penalty. Samuel Willie still sought his property, bounty posters perhaps bearing William's likeness. Safety demanded exile. In 1849, William sailed for England, where slavery had died in 1833 and abolitionists reigned. British audiences received him as a prophet, horrified by American barbarity persisting in a supposedly enlightened republic. He lectured across the aisles, dined with intellectuals and reformers, experienced dignity unmarred by color. Here, a black man was treated as equal, a revelation that exposed America's spiritual bankruptcy. In this refuge, William birthed his masterpiece, Clotel, or The President's Daughter, published December 1853 in London. The first novel by an African American, it shattered literary barriers while dropping a moral bomb on America's foundations. Clotel followed two sisters, daughters of Thomas Jefferson and his enslaved concubine Kerr, sold into bondage despite bearing the blood of the Declaration's author. Their tragedies illuminated slavery's ultimate hypocrisy, the man who penned "all men are created equal fathering children he." Condemned to chains, their lighter skin a living indictment of the nation's founding sin. Through Clotel's desperate escape attempts, her sister's degradation, and her own tragic end, William wove biblical themes of justice deferred, sins of the fathers visiting children, divine retribution hovering over a hypocritical republic. The novel wasn't mere fiction, it was prophecy, exposing secrets powerful men had buried, daring the world to confront America's original curse. William Wells Brown had journeyed from frozen fugitive to international voice of conscience. His escape wasn't merely personal salvation, it was the spark of a literary and moral revolution, demanding that a nation face its shadowed bloodlines or perish in divine judgment. The story wasn't over. Far from it. For in exposing Jefferson's hidden daughters, William had lit a fuse that would burn toward civil war and toward a reckoning still unfinished. In the gaslit drawing rooms of Victorian London, where the fog curled like guilty secrets through cobblestone streets, a book landed like a thunderbolt from an avenging angel. December 1853. Clotel, or The President's Daughter. Penned by William Wells Brown, a man born in chains, forged in flight, tempered by exile, this was no ordinary novel. It was the first ever written by an African American, a literary earthquake that shattered the polished marble facade of American mythology. And at its molten core burned a truth so incendiary, so spiritually corrosive, that powerful forces would spend the next century trying to extinguish its light. Clotel was not gentle fiction. It was a blade, sharp, unflinching, drawn across the nation's throat. William painted slavery not as a distant abstraction, but as a living abomination, the stench of auction blocks where human flesh was weighed like pork, the screams of mothers as infants were wrenched from their breasts, the casual violation of enslaved women whose bodies were claimed as property under the same laws that proclaimed liberty and justice for all. He described coffles snaking south under a merciless sun, iron links clanking like the chains of damned souls in Dante's Inferno. He evoked the slave pens of New Orleans, where light-skinned women, often the unacknowledged daughters of white masters, were paraded for fancy buyers, their beauty a curse that invited exploitation rather than mercy. But William's deepest cut was reserved for the heart of American sanctity, Thomas Jefferson himself. The novel's heroine, Clotel, is Jefferson's daughter by Kerr, an enslaved woman echoing Sally Hemings. Fair-skinned, refined, intelligent, Clotel embodies the tragic limbo of those born from forbidden unions, too white to be fully enslaved in the eyes of morality, yet condemned by law to chains because their mothers were property. Sold away from her mother. Manipulated into a false promise of freedom by a white lover who abandons her, separated from her own child. Clotel's life is a cascade of betrayals that mirror the nation's own. In the book's shattering climax, pursued by slave catchers through the streets of Washington, D.C., Clotel stands on a bridge over the Potomac. Behind her, barking hounds and armed men. Before her, the gleaming white dome of the Capitol, seat of a government built on the lie that all men are created equal. In that moment, she chooses death over recapture, leaping into the river's cold embrace, her body vanishing beneath waters that reflect the monument to hypocrisy itself. The symbolism seared like divine judgment. Clotel dies in the very shadow of the Temple of Liberty, her suicide a prophetic accusation. How can a nation preach freedom while devouring its own children? Her plunge echoes the biblical warning, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap, a harvest of blood for seeds of sin planted by the founding fathers." Jefferson, architect of American ideals, stands indicted not just as a slaveholder, but as a man who fathered children in bondage and permitted their sale, his lofty words hollowed by personal transgression. William did not invent this scandal. Rumors of Jefferson and Sally Hemings had festered since 1802, when journalist James Callender, bitter over political betrayal, published explosive allegations. Jefferson's defenders dismissed them as vicious slander, the venom of partisan warfare. For decades, the story was whispered in shadows, denied in daylight. No one had dared elevate it to the center of a major work, to weave it into fiction that claimed moral truth. William did. Drawing from fugitive testimonies, his own lived horrors with traitor James Walker, and the Hemings legacy, he transformed rumor into revelation, a literary act of courage that implicated not just one man, but an entire nation's spiritual bankruptcy. In England, where slavery had been abolished in 1833, Clotel ignited acclaim. Reviewers hailed its raw emotional force, its unflinching gaze into America's abyss. Abolitionists brandished it as irrefutable evidence, translating it into French, German, and other tongues to shame the United States on the world stage. British audiences wept at William's lectures, horrified that the land of the free clung to such barbarity. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was volcanic rage. Southern presses erupted in fury, branding Clotel vile slander and William a malignant liar whose filthy fabrications threatened social order. They defended slavery as a benevolent institution, enslaved people as contented under kind masters, a grotesque inversion of truth that echoed Pharaoh's denial of Israel's suffering. Northern papers fractured, some lauded the novel's moral clarity, others decried it as inflammatory fuel for sectional fire. But the Jefferson allegations struck deepest, wounding national pride. To accept them was to tarnish a demigod, to admit that the Declaration's sacred words were stained from inception by the ink of hypocrisy. Clotel was banned across southern states. Booksellers stocking it faced mob violence. William received anonymous letters in England, graphic threats of lynching, dismemberment, promises that no ocean could shield him forever. Pro-slavery agitators disrupted his lectures, hurling eggs, shouting epithets, even rushing stages. Yet William stood resolute, his voice steady as a prophet's, "I will not be silenced." He poured his fire into more works, 3 Years in Europe, 1852, a travelogue exposing racial contradictions, The Escape, or A Leap for Freedom, 1858, the first play by a black American, The Black Man, 1863, chronicling African American contributions, The Negro in the American Rebellion, 1867, honoring black soldiers. He became a transatlantic intellectual titan, lecturer, historian, dramatist, living proof against racist myths of inferiority. In 1854, British friends purchased his legal freedom from Enoch Price, successor to Samuel Willie's claim, a symbolic act granting safe return. William sailed home, resuming the fight. During the Civil War, he recruited for legendary regiments like the 54th Massachusetts, tended wounded as a self-taught physician, witnessed black valor that helped crush the Confederacy. When victory came in 1865, hope flickered. Reconstruction's dawn brought amendments abolishing slavery, granting citizenship and voting rights. Black communities flourished, schools rose, representatives sat in Congress, a glimpse of the beloved community. But the light was brief. White terror surged, Ku Klux Klan night rides, lynchings, poll taxes, fraudulent elections. Northern weariness abandoned the cause. By 1877, federal troops withdrew, and Jim Crow ascended, a new bondage of segregation, disenfranchisement, and ritualized violence. To sustain this order, history itself was rewritten. The lost cause mythology blossomed, slavery recast as gentle paternalism, enslaved people as loyal and happy, the Civil War as noble defense of states' rights rather than human property. Textbooks peddled these lies, erasing black agency. Figures like William, whose life demolished racist pseudoscience, were systematically vanished. Clotel faded from print. Anthologies exalted Hawthorne, Melville, Stowe, but omitted the black pioneer who preceded them in novelistic indictment. Frederick Douglass endured in memory, but William, whose truths cut too close to founding myths, was buried deeper. Why him specifically? Because William was lethal to the lie. His intellect, eloquence, and achievements proved black equality beyond debate. His exposure of Jefferson's enslaved children struck at the Republic's origin story, revealing the Declaration not as divine revelation, but as compromised scripture, its author a sinner whose personal failings mirrored national ones. To reconcile after war, America needed amnesia, minimize slavery's horrors, sanctify founders, marginalize black voices. William's survival threatened that fragile peace. He died November 6, 1884, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, 70 years old, surrounded by family, his extraordinary arc from Kentucky plantation to global platform complete. Obituaries praised him, yet the erasure accelerated. Only in the late 20th century, amid civil rights reckonings, did scholars unearth him. Archives yielded forgotten editions, letters, speeches. Clotel was republished, acclaimed as proto-realist masterpiece and feminist text. And in 1998, DNA evidence vindicated William utterly. Thomas Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings's children. The slander was truth, scientific confirmation of what a fugitive slave had dared assert 145 years earlier. Today, Clotel graces university syllabi, analyzed for its subversive power. Yet William remains obscure. High school textbooks rarely mention him. Most Americans have never heard the name of the first black novelist, the Underground Railroad conductor, the transatlantic abolitionist whose life embodied resurrection from bondage. His erasure endures as indictment not just of past sins, but of ongoing narrative control. History is not neutral ledger, it is battleground where the powerful bury inconvenient prophets. William's story warns, truths that discomfort authority are first demonized, then forgotten. But it also inspires. Because memory is rebellion. Every time we speak his name, teach Clotel, acknowledge Jefferson's full legacy, we resurrect William. We honor the spiritual warrior who risked all to declare, no democracy built on stolen bodies and silenced bloodlines can claim divine favor. William Wells Brown did not merely escape slavery. He exposed its spiritual rot at America's core, the original sin woven into founding documents, demanding perpetual atonement. His voice, silenced for a century by deliberate amnesia, echoes now as divine summons, reckon with the past, or repeat its judgments. The question is no longer whether William deserves a place beside Hawthorne and Melville. He deserves center stage as pioneer, truth-teller, living refutation of the lies that once justified chains and still echo in subtler forms. What truths are we burying today? Whose voices are being erased in our textbooks, our monuments, our national story? William fought so we might ask these questions. The least we can do is listen and refuse to forget.